My name is Jenna, and I've been married for 3 years now at the age of 30. My husband, Seth, who's 32, works at his family business. His family owns a wholesale liquor company where his father is the president and Seth serves as the director. Ever since we got married, I've been working there as well as an office clerk. My mother-in-law has never involved herself with the family business, having been a stay-at-home mom for the longest time. And when I say stay at home, she used to employ a housekeeper, so she never really had to lift a finger. When I married into the family and started living with my in-laws, they let the housekeeper go. Why would we need a housekeeper when we've got a daughter-in-law? My mother-in-law remarked, and both my father-in-law and husband seemed to agree with her. It seems my father-in-law, who has taken into his wife's family, has never been able to stand up to his wife. Growing up, Seth saw his father always obeying his mother's commands. It's as if he believes that obeying every word is the natural order of things. Even when we visited for the first time before we got married, it was evident that she was the one who ruled the house. Since becoming a part of this family, I've been burdened with both housework and office work. The alcohol wholesale business has been in a tight spot lately, and we can't afford to hire more staff, so I've been lending a hand. They had to let the housekeeper go because the money to pay her was running out. Nevertheless, this company, which has been around since my husband's grandfather's time, manages to keep going thanks to long-standing business relationships. The grandfather founded the company in his lifetime and expanded it to its current scale. There are about 10 employees who handle sales and deliveries, even delivering quite far away. The grandfather, having no son of his own, had my father-in-law, who was a promising employee, take over the business. He arranged for my father-in-law to marry his only daughter and entrusted the company to them. I never met this grandfather myself, but apparently he was a stern man. Dad is a patient man, Seth often says, praising his father. He never got angry, no matter what was said to him. Grandpa was pretty stern, but Mom is even more so. Seth, who accepts whatever his mom tells him, talks about it as if it's someone else's business. Until we got married and started living together, I couldn't have imagined this side of Seth. While we were dating, he seemed like a bit of a wild one, but at home, he becomes almost invisible. He's also lively and energetic at work, but turns quiet as soon as he gets home. The same is true for my father-in-law, who's bustling at the company, but becomes as quiet as a church mouse at home. I was shocked at first by their transformation, but now I find myself in the same boat. In this house, my mother-in-law is the absolute authority, and no one dares to defy her. When we first started living together, she made a huge fuss because she didn't like the food I made. The dinner I made casually was apparently too spicy for her, and she tossed it into the trash after just one bite. In a panic, I quickly apologized. "I'm sorry, was it too spicy?" My mother-in-law made me stand before her and began her lecture. "Are you trying to make me sick by making me eat something this spicy?" I was petrified by the sight of my mother-in-law's face, which looked like a demon. Seth and my father-in-law stopped eating their meals and sat rigidly, their eyes cast downwards. When I cast a fleeting glance at them for help, I saw Seth's face, even paler than mine. When I looked at my father-in-law, he too had a pale face, just like Seth. From their expressions, I could imagine how terrifying my mother-in-law's lectures were. After enduring more than 30 minutes of my mother-in-law's sermon, I had forgotten why she was angry in the first place. Even my angry mother-in-law seemed to have gotten hungry and ended up eating the meals I made. Seth and my father-in-law have always lived with my mother-in-law, so they've learned to live quietly at home. That's when I started to regret marrying into such a formidable family. When my mother-in-law was a young adult, her father's company was at its peak. An employee who had just been working for the company for a long time spoke nostalgically about it when he was retiring. Apparently, they had more than double the number of employees they have now, and their sales were incomparably higher. My mother-in-law had experienced this prosperous era and finds it hard to lower her standard of living. That's probably why she used to hire a housekeeper and never did any household chores herself. My mother-in-law loves shopping and often goes out, bringing back loads of things. I don't know how much money she spends, but given the company's current performance, it's starting to worry me. Seth and my father-in-law don't say anything about her shopping, so I keep my mouth shut too. If I made an ill-considered comment, I might get a lecture that lasts longer than 30 minutes. Before I knew it, I had started to think like Seth and my father-in-law. For about a year after our marriage, I was fully occupied trying to get used to the lifestyle in my husband's family and the work at the company. By the time 2 years had passed, I was facing a bigger problem. We were unable to have a child. Particularly, in my mother-in-law's mind, was her experience of not having a son in her father's generation and having to take in a son-in-law. She worries that the same thing should not happen in Seth's generation. As we approached our 3rd year of marriage, she started to make sarcastic comments every chance she got. "When are you going to give us an heir? You didn't marry into this family to be an office clerk." Even the sight of a baby on TV would set her off. "There are so many babies in the world. Why don't we have one here?" She'd glare at me. Seth and my father-in-law would disappear whenever this topic started. Hearing this day after day, I began to feel there was no place for me in this family. I wished Seth would help. But no matter how many times I confided in him, he'd say, "Don't worry about it, just let it go." As if he didn't want to be involved. At the same time, the company's situation was deteriorating. My father-in-law's company, with its old-fashioned business style, was unable to get work from trendy eateries and the like. My mother-in-law seemed to sense this, even though Seth and my father-in-law didn't talk about it with her. Still, she couldn't stop her favorite activity, shopping, and brought home all sorts of things. Whether she was angry at herself, I don't know, but she'd come home from shopping in a bad mood. Then her anger would be directed at me. "It's Jenna's fault for not producing an heir. That's why I end up buying unnecessary things." My mother-in-law, who blamed me for incomprehensible reasons, seemed to pin all the blame on me. Perhaps because of her daily grumbles, my health started to fail. I asked Seth and my father-in-law to let me take a break from work and got tested at the hospital. Seth seemed hopeful that I might be pregnant, but it was due to stress. It would be best to rest a little in a relaxing environment, but there was no relaxing environment for me at present, nor could I afford to rest. Knowing it was impossible, I explained the situation to Seth and my in-laws when I got home. The doctor said it would be better if I could rest a little, but it's okay. Surprisingly, my mother-in-law said, "You should go back to your parents' house and rest for a while." She even told my father-in-law, "We can manage, right? It seems like we're not so busy right now." It seemed like she was urging them to let me take a break from work. My father-in-law, surprised by my mother-in-law's words, replied, "We can cover for you. It's okay," with a relieved look on his face. I was shocked by my mother-in-law's unexpected words. At this time, I thought she might actually be a kind person. But that was a big mistake. She was just a person with a bad temper after all. The next day, I went back to my parents' house right away to rest. When I told them on the phone that I was coming back, they seemed very worried. When my mother saw me in person, she said, "You look pale and thin. Haven't you lost weight?" she asked with a voice on the verge of tears. "First, take some rest and recover." My father also welcomed me. He seemed to understand everything from my expression. He must have understood that things weren't going well with my in-laws, because stress was the cause. I felt bad for worrying my parents by coming back home. My health improved quickly after I returned to my parents' house. Clearly, the environment of my in-laws' house was the cause of stress. About a week after I arrived at my parents' house, my in-laws suddenly showed up. I could understand if my husband Seth showed up, but I never thought my in-laws would come to my parents' house. My mother-in-law suddenly started yelling as soon as she arrived. "We're returning this good-for-nothing daughter-in-law who can't even bear an heir. It's up to the parents to take responsibility." Even my mother, who met her at the door, was too surprised to respond. My father rushed to the entrance and challenged her. "I can't let it go if you call my daughter a failure. What do you mean?" My mother-in-law fought back when my father immediately rebutted her. 3 years into marriage and still no baby. What's more, she's weak and can't work." My mother, finally regaining her composure, counterattacked. "Isn't Seth also responsible for not having a child?" My mother-in-law dismissed her with a snort, making baseless excuses. "There's nothing wrong with Seth. The problem lies with your daughter." My father, maintaining his composure against my mother-in-law's unreasonable remarks, said, "If you insist on that, we'll take our daughter back. Are you fine with Jenna leaving?" I, who didn't want to face my mother-in-law, was watching the situation from a place where they couldn't see me. My father glanced at me for confirmation. The image of Seth flashed in my mind, but I nodded. Seth hasn't visited me once since I came back home, and he can't stand up against his mother's remarks. There's a limit to calling someone a failure or trying to return them like some defective product. From now on, we'll have no relation with you. Please remember that." My father responded very politely. My father-in-law, hiding behind my mother-in-law, seemed like he wanted to say something. However, my mother-in-law cut him off. "We'll send the failure of a daughter-in-law's luggage later. We'll hire a divorce lawyer too." With that, my in-laws, who glared at my parents, left. Why didn't you say something more to such rude remarks? My mother, this time, turned on my father. Calming her down, he said, "There's no use talking to that woman. Don't worry. We'll make her realize her mistake through our actions, not words." My mother, not understanding what my father meant, was still furious. I, however, understood immediately. My father-in-law also knew, which is why he tried to say something. My father runs a restaurant chain and has a business relationship with my father-in-law's company. As someone who used to work in administration, I knew this. In fact, it was my father who introduced me to Seth. He had been doing business with my father-in-law's company since the time my grandfather-in-law was the president. My father's company, which started from a single store and struggled at first, received help from my grandfather-in-law. To this day, with a significantly larger number of stores, he procures all the alcohol and beverages from my father-in-law's company. To be honest, it seems cheaper to source from elsewhere, but they continue trading out of gratitude to my grandfather-in-law. Given that my father's company also runs an affiliated pub, it's a big account for my father-in-law's company. My mother-in-law, who didn't know about this, was able to maintain her attitude towards my father. The next day, my father called my father-in-law's company and told the person in charge, "We're ending all transactions with you." The flustered person in charge immediately reported to my father-in-law and Seth. My father-in-law, who had not anticipated that all transactions would be stopped, finally lost his temper with my mother-in-law. "Because of you, we have lost a major business deal." The normally gentle father-in-law's fury and the loss of a major deal seemed to have shocked my mother-in-law. "What? It's because of me?" My father-in-law explained to my mother-in-law that I am the daughter of a major client. When Seth and I got married, this was brought up, and my father-in-law thought my mother-in-law remembered it. She, who didn't care about business, had completely forgotten and only then remembered. "Now that you mention it, I vaguely recall something about it when Seth was getting married." Finally, grasping the severity of the situation, my mother-in-law was flustered. Seth also lashed out at her. "What were you thinking? Deciding on Jenna and my divorce on your own?" I had reported to Seth about my mother-in-law demanding a divorce from me. "I don't want a divorce. Moreover, if things continue this way, our company will collapse." Given that my father's company is a large client and profitable, if the transactions stop, they wouldn't be able to manage the business. Presently, all trading partners are demanding lower prices and they're hardly making any profit. My father's company, due to the relationship between my grandfather-in-law and my father, hadn't requested any price reduction. Such a relationship of trust seemed to be the only reason why my father introduced Seth to me. That evening, my in-laws and Seth came to my parents' house, but my father did not allow them inside. At the door, my father asked, "After all the disrespect, what brings you here today?" His anger was evident, as my father-in-law apologized from the bottom of his heart and pleaded, "We are sorry for our behavior yesterday. Could we ask you to reconsider our trade relationship?" Despite his plea, my father didn't seem to lend an ear. "We were trading out of respect for the former president. But let's end it now," my father said. And my father-in-law apologized over and over again. Then, turning to Seth and my mother-in-law, he said, "You two should apologize as well." Prompted by my father-in-law, both seemed unwilling. Moreover, my mother-in-law stated, Why do we have to go this far? Let's just give up and find another trading partner. Expressing her refusal to prostrate, Seth also followed suit. There's no need for us to apologize, as Mom said. They wouldn't listen to my father-in-law. Seeing Seth's attitude, my father became even angrier. Seth, I am disappointed in you. Why didn't you defend my daughter? At my father's words, Seth couldn't respond and kept his gaze low. Because you always do whatever my mother-in-law says. I've been suffering. Without thinking, I rushed to the entrance and finally voiced my feelings towards Seth. Seth tried to speak, but watching my mother-in-law's facial expression, he couldn't say anything. Seeing him like this, I decided that divorce was the only option. Until now, I thought we might be able to mend things, but even that tiny hope vanished completely. I'll pick up my belongings later, I told Seth clearly. My mother-in-law didn't seem to like this attitude of mine and started making a fuss. Yes, that's right. Seth needs to get a divorce from you quickly and find a new bride. My mother-in-law, who had come to apologize, started to badmouth me again. This time we'll get a bride who isn't a failure and can give us a successor. With that, she loudly walked out of our house alone. Seth immediately followed her. My father-in-law, who was left behind, was urged by my father to stop apologizing. I've made my decision. I'm going to close the company and leave the house. Surprising both my father and me. Is your business situation that bad? My father asked, and my father-in-law responded with a bitter smile. I've been considering closing down the company for a few years now, due to continued losses. While I knew their situation was tough, I didn't think it was that serious. I worked hard to leave the company to my son, but it was all in vain with him behaving like this, hunching his back as he left. The next day, when I went to pick up my stuff from my in-laws' house, nobody was there. As I was moving my belongings and about to show up at the company, I found a great uproar. Creditors who heard rumors of the bankruptcy were swarming, and my father-in-law and Seth were handling them. I left without greeting anyone. A few days later, my father-in-law's company declared bankruptcy. My mother-in-law, who had a large amount of debt, filed for personal bankruptcy and ran away with Seth. It seems Seth intends to follow his mother wherever she goes. My father-in-law is looking for re-employment for the remaining employees. I wish Seth could have thought about the employees until the end like his father did. Back home for a rest. I became well again. I never thought I would get a divorce during my convalescence. Seeing me depressed after the divorce, a friend who was worried about me introduced me to a man. This man, who has firm beliefs, captivated me. After about a year of dating, we got married, and we were blessed with a baby. When I got pregnant easily, something I had been hoping for so long. I thought the problem must have been with Seth. Now, I can laugh about it. But at the same time, I was so troubled that it affected my health. Perhaps a peaceful environment was good for me. In any case, now I can't wait for the arrival of our baby. 9 people? That's just too many. What do you think this is, a baseball team? I've always had a dream since I was a child. A cute house like the ones in picture books, with a white dog in the yard. But reality isn't always so sweet. I finally managed to get my own house. But when I returned from work, it had transformed into something like a dormitory. I won't forgive them for this. My name is Mary, a 32-year-old office worker. I've been focused on my career, but since my late 20s, my friends started getting married one after another. There were months when wedding gifts really added up to my expenses. Feeling a mysterious urgency, I started trying my hand at dating.
Mary, when are you going to give me grandkids?
Every time I visited home, my dad, David, would say this, and it made me so uncomfortable that I gradually stopped visiting as much. My mom passed away when I was young, so I grew up with my dad, my brother, and my paternal grandparents. My brother married early and built a house near our childhood home. He has 2 daughters, my adorable nieces. I've got cute nieces at my brother's place. Isn't that enough for you?
But you, Mary.
We always ended up arguing about it. Then, after a while, my dad was involved in a traffic accident. By the time I got to the hospital, he was in a very bad state. My energetic father quietly passed away while my brother's family and I watched over him. Dad, I had someone I wanted you to meet. Actually, at that time I had a boyfriend, introduced to me by a friend. He had just proposed, and we decided to marry. He was a bit of a show-off, but a kind man. His name was Richard. Now with both my parents gone and my brother having his own family, it's gotten lonely, hasn't it? I muttered this, stroking my cat Lucy after returning home from the funeral.
Mary, you're not alone. You're going to be a part of my family.
Richard, sitting next to me, gently held my hand. He came to check on me, worried about how I was doing.
Let's build a happy home together.
I thought I could have an ordinary happiness. Little did I know back then what would happen. Welcome! It's a bit cramped, though. I visited Richard's family home for a family meeting. Patricia, his mother, spoke plainly and was full of energy. I hesitated as I entered the room, thinking it would be just the in-laws, but it was crowded with in-laws, step-grandparents, Richard's brother Charles, and his wife Sarah, and their kids, Thomas and John. Nice to meet you. Wow, that's a lot of people. The house, built by James, Richard's father, felt somewhat run down. Honestly, it was old, but the family welcomed me warmly, easing my nerves. On the way back in the car, speaking of which, there were so many people today. Christmas or Thanksgiving must be quite an event, I said to Richard, who laughed in response.
It really is cramped there. Can't believe they manage to live like that every day.
Hearing this, I was genuinely surprised. Richard's family home was never really spacious. I thought it was just a temporary gathering. 8 people in that house? Wow, that's something. Richard said it was originally just the 4 of them, his in-laws and step-grandparents. But then Charles, who couldn't hold down a job, moved in one day with Sarah and their kids without asking.
Charles will probably move out once he finds a stable job,"
Richard said with a laugh. Back then I just thought Richard's family had its challenges, nothing more. After marriage, Richard and I, along with our cat Lucy, lived a peaceful life without kids yet. Richard was fairly helpful around the house, and Lucy was fond of us. As for his family, Charles and his family were still living in that house. The walls were covered in children's scribbles, and Patricia laughed, saying she gave up on cleaning them long ago. Sarah, Charles's wife, always looked tired. She was older than Charles and close to my age, so we became friends quickly. "Hey, Sarah, hurry up!"
"Mary, don't just stand there. We're out of beer."
Whenever I visited, it seemed like Sarah and I were the only ones not sitting down. We were constantly busy, and I wondered if this was our fate, but the thought of Sarah doing this every day was honestly frightening. Sarah worked full-time, filling in for Charles, who hardly worked. I hesitated to ask, but finally did. "Have you ever thought about leaving him?" "I've heard that before." "Well, it's tough as it is, but we have kids, and he used to be so kind." I couldn't see any good in Charles, but I guess they had their reasons. That's what I thought. It was around this time.
"How about we build our own house?"
Richard suddenly suggested. I was surprised, but also happy. Actually, I've had a small dream since I was little. I'd always dreamed of living in a quaint house like those in storybooks, with a white dog in the yard. I have a white dog in the garden. I'd never told anyone, but when I shared this dream with Richard, a bit shyly.
"That sounds great,"
he said. We spent our free days visiting model homes, choosing a housemaker, and a year later, our dream home was completed.
"We've got to make sure we keep up with the mortgage,"
Richard said. "Absolutely," I replied with a smile. On the first weekend after moving in, Richard's family came over for a housewarming party. "Here, Joseph, hand over the gift. We're coming in." "Oh, what a lovely house!" Patricia seemed quite pleased, as if it was her own home. I smiled politely.
"Look, it's a celebration!"
And then Joseph handed me 2 cans of beer, looking like he'd just bought them. I mean, seriously? Charles wandered around the house and, finding our bedroom, exclaimed, "Oh, this bed is super comfy!" Saying that, Charles started rolling around on the bed. The kids, following their father's lead, got excited.
"Look, there's a cat!"
They ran around, chasing our pet cat Lucy. Lucy is friendly, but she had never met so many people at once, so she got scared and hid in the back of the room. Poor Lucy. I glanced at Charles and Richard, who had already started a party with the in-laws. "Mary, Patricia is insisting on appetizers quickly. Can I use your kitchen? And sorry about scaring Lucy," Sarah said apologetically. Why is someone as nice as her with a guy like that? I had grown to care for Sarah like a real sister. "I'll handle it, Sarah. You relax," I said, but she still helped with the cooking while managing the kids. The step-grandparents were always quiet, almost like dolls, not talking much. But they said, "What a lovely home, right, James?"
"Yeah, sorry for the noise,"
James replied, even though the loud ones were the in-laws. The step-grandparents were the ones with common sense in that house. In other words, the odd ones out were the in-laws, Charles, and probably my husband Richard too. From then on, the in-laws and Charles would visit our house almost every weekend. They partied till dawn, so loud that we got complaints from neighbors and even the police once. The step-grandparents, Sarah, and the kids hadn't visited our house since the housewarming, but the in-laws didn't hesitate to put me to work. I was at my wits' end. Richard had also started showing his true colors. Once, I had a cold. I was too weak to prepare dinner and asked Richard, who was home early from work, to pick something up. He came back with 2 hamburgers. I couldn't even think of eating them. "Why hamburgers? I can't eat this right now," I said without thinking, instead of getting angry.
"What are you talking about, Mary? You need to eat to get your strength back,"
Richard said. What? If I had the energy to eat that, I wouldn't have asked for help in the first place. I thought to myself. By the way, when Richard was sick once, "Want a hamburger?" I asked him sarcastically. His response was,
"No, that's ridiculous. Are you trying to annoy me?"
That's what I said. In short, this family was self-centered and lacked empathy. They were done for as people. Enjoy your freedom while it lasts. I'll make sure you all get what you deserve. With that thought, I smirked wickedly. A few days later, I had a business trip scheduled. On the morning of my departure, "Well, I'm off then," I said cheerfully to Richard.
"Was your business trip starting today? What a coincidence. Sarah is also on a business trip from today,"
said Richard. "Really? I had no idea. What a coincidence," I replied.
"Mom said they'd be in trouble without someone to take care of the house."
Richard laughed mockingly, making me think, what a jerk. I was busy during my time away from home. Days flew by quickly, and before I knew it, a lot of time had passed. A major typhoon hit, and I contacted Richard.
"We're fine, but the family home had some serious leaks,"
he replied. Thinking of the old family home, I felt it was understandable. The day I returned home arrived. As I walked from the nearest bus stop to my house, I heard loud, unrefined laughter echoing in the residential area. Is someone having a barbecue in their yard? The noise was that loud. This will surely attract complaints from the neighbors. Wait, what? I was shocked. The loud voices were unmistakably coming from my house. As I cautiously opened the door, I found many bags in the entrance, and the walls were covered in graffiti. Stunned, I was at a loss for words.
"Hey, Mary, welcome back!"
A drunken Richard greeted me. Frustrated by his insensitivity, I entered the living room to find equally drunk in-laws and Charles, with Sarah making appetizers for them in the kitchen. The step-grandparents were quiet as usual, and the kids were happily drawing on the living room walls. Then there was another young woman I didn't know. Overwhelmed by everything, I felt my mind about to snap. "What is all this?" I asked Richard calmly, trying not to get emotional.
Didn't I tell you? The family home had leaks because of the typhoon."
I heard that part. And then? Richard's story was this. The family home had a massive leak, and the in-laws, having nowhere else to go, temporarily moved into our house. Without Sarah, who was away, the in-laws, Charles and Richard, decided,
"We thought, why not live here?"
Richard said proudly. What? Even with this explanation, I was baffled. To my silence,
"It's fine, we're family. We have extra rooms, no problem,"
the in-laws added, smiling.
"It's all right, Mary. The walls got a bit dirty, but it's just kid stuff,"
Charles said nonchalantly. And who is that woman? I asked about the woman lounging on the sofa, fiddling with her phone.
"Oh, that's Karen, a mutual friend of me and Sarah. Right, Sarah?"
Charles asked her. "Yeah, that's right," she answered with a smile.
"This girl, Karen, was kicked out by her parents, and Richard said it was okay for her to stay."
"Thanks in advance." The not-so-bright-looking girl replied, leaving me utterly confused. In our not-so-spacious living room, there were 9 adults and 2 children. The room was a mess, the walls covered in scribbles, making it look nothing like a new house. The family was loud like a dormitory. I couldn't help but lose my temper. Seriously? 9 people is too many. Are you guys planning to start a baseball team or what? Then I realized something. Hey, where's Lucy? Our pet cat Lucy was nowhere to be found. When I asked Richard and the others, they all claimed ignorance, while frantically searching for Lucy.
Lucy, huh? Dad opened the window to smoke and she ran away,
Thomas told me. Charles glared at the boy as if he had said something he shouldn't have. What were you thinking? I told you to be careful with the windows, I said, near tears. Richard, looking annoyed, said,
Oh, come on. It's just a cat. We can get another one. What's with you? If you're unhappy, we can just get divorced, you know.
He said it with such a disdainful face. You just said divorce? I asked.
Yeah, I did. I might consider not doing it if you apologize to us.
Richard, along with the in-laws and Charles, seemed confident that I wouldn't go through with a divorce. I replied, Oh, really? Well, then here, write this. I slammed down the divorce papers I had prepared. My section was already filled out. I fetched my pre-packed bags from my room. Done? Why haven't you written it yet? I'm busy, you know, and said coolly to Richard. They were all shocked by my preparedness. Angrily, Patricia said, Richard, divorce this woman already. We've built the house, so she's useless now. Patricia said that. Realizing too late, Richard said,
Right, Mary. You'll regret divorcing me.
But I had no regrets. What are you talking about? You're the one who's going to struggle. Just write the divorce papers. Once Richard finished writing, I snatched the papers and put them in my bag. Then I went to Charles and said, Here, you need to write this too, handing him the divorce papers. He laughed.
What? When did I marry you?
Looking at the filled-in wife section, Charles said,
Hey, Sarah, this is...
Sarah coldly stared at Charles and said, I'm divorcing you. Write it now, please. To which Charles exclaimed,
Sarah, bite the hand that feeds you, huh?
Joseph was talking nonsense. From my perspective, Sarah had been living like a slave in her in-laws' house. The money she earned was mostly taken by Charles, leaving only a little for living expenses. The money let Charles do whatever he wanted, and the not-so-bright girl in front of me, she was Charles's mistress. Mary, I think my husband is cheating on me. Sarah had confided in me just before Richard suggested building a house. Sarah had been enduring it all for the sake of her children, but recently, Charles had even started selling Sarah's belongings and the kids' toys for his own gain. She had reached her limit. Then Sarah told me a story. After hearing Sarah's story, I was furious. From that day, Sarah and I started planning our divorces. Sarah gathered thorough evidence of the affair. Her recent business trip was a lie. We met halfway to look for a new place to live. Like me, Sarah's parents had passed away, and she had no relatives to turn to. However, a close friend offered her a job at their shop in another state. It was a good location, and our preparations went smoothly. All that was left was to present the divorce papers. I want to get some people out of that hellish house. Sarah had made up her mind and was incredibly strong. She had a strong core, but had been used by her in-laws like she was brainwashed. Thinking it would look suspicious to return together, Sarah went back first. She soon contacted me, informing me about the takeover of my house and Charles's brazen mistress moving in. All our conversations and actions until then were a performance. Knowing what was going on, I told Sarah, "We're not living in that house anymore. Let the kids draw on the walls all they want." That's what I told him. Charles, thinking he could now openly live with his mistress, happily signed the divorce papers. "Let's go, Sarah. James and everyone, it's time to leave." The step-grandparents stood up and followed Sarah and her children to the door.
"Living with people like you, I had given up on life, but Sarah opened my eyes. Do as you please now,"
James said, glaring at the family, and left with his great-grandchildren. The in-laws had been taking money from the step-grandparents' pensions. They were truly awful people. "Well then, take care," we said as we left like a storm.
"You'll regret this."
The family laughed as we left, but we ignored them. Months later, Richard contacted me. Oh, I forgot to block him. I could guess the content of the call, so I answered.
"Mary, come back!"
Richard sounded desperate. I barely contained my laughter. "Come back? We're strangers now," I replied calmly.
"Let me talk! Mary, what do you mean? Why aren't you paying the mortgage?"
Patricia's voice came through, probably snatching the phone from Richard. "What are you talking about? I have no idea." I played dumb, while Patricia sounded frustrated. Apparently, the house's mortgage had already fallen behind last month. When I pressed Richard, he claimed I hadn't been paying the mortgage. What an inconvenience! While I remained silent, Patricia kept talking like a machine gun.
"First of all, this house, you guys had a combined income of $75,000, right? We could have built a better house. We built this as a new home, but it's not what we expected."
Originally, they had planned to take over the house. Sarah had informed me of their discussions. Yes, that's true. But with Richard's $30,000 salary, the bank wouldn't lend us more. If we had taken a joint mortgage, maybe we could have gotten a better house. Hearing this,
"Richard, you lied!"
I could hear Richard and Patricia arguing on the phone. I ignored them, ended the call, and finally blocked his number. Richard had a pretentious personality. Richard always wanted to impress others, especially outside his family. When he suggested building a house, I already had divorce in mind. I told him, "A friend's husband got a mortgage on his own. How cool is that?" I heard these stories like a spell. Richard, wanting to show off, opted for a solo mortgage. I had to hold back my laughter. He probably didn't tell his family because he was afraid of them knowing the truth. But I didn't care. The house was built to Richard's taste. I had no attachment to it anymore. Richard hadn't cheated, but there were no alimony or penalties in our divorce. So, to spite him, I left him with the mortgage debt as my revenge. Let him suffer. And I was able to rescue Sarah, whom I cared for like a sister, from that house. That was my main goal. Later, they couldn't pay the mortgage and the new house was repossessed. But it was a mess inside, with scribbles everywhere, and walls yellowed by cigarette smoke from Charles and his mistress. It didn't look like a recently built house. Richard had to rent a cheap apartment and Joseph and Patricia ended up moving in with him. They'll probably never leave him alone, like parasites. I don't care, they're strangers to me now. The only good thing about my former in-laws was that the children weren't affected. Otherwise, they were the worst. Sarah, as Charles's ex-wife,
successfully claimed alimony through a lawyer. She had to borrow money, but managed to pay it off. I'm glad for her. Charles and his mistress became outcasts in their community and are now missing. They haven't repaid their debts, confirming how awful they are. Sarah is happily working at her friend's place. Her kids are doing well too. I hope they find happiness this time. James and Barbara seem brighter now, like a weight has been lifted. They sold the old family home and are enjoying their retirement in a distant place with their savings. That's great news. As for me, I've requested a transfer to a local office. I was reunited with Lucy, my cat. Thanks to social media, someone in the neighborhood had found and taken care of her. It's good she's friendly. Now, I live alone in my late father's house. With my brother's approval, I'm saving to build my dream house. And someday, I hope to introduce someone special at my father's grave. Today, I'm working hard towards that goal.